All right, I think we can begin to get started here. Tonight we have one of Earth's Week's featured speakers, Bob Martini. He will be talking about several Wisconsin cases where properly designed environmental regulation resulted in benefits for the environment and the people, as well as economic benefits as well. And then he also wants to really make attention to the importance of natural resources in management. So we will welcome Bob Martini.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Somebody get these lights. Thank you. In the past 8 years or so, we've had a sea change in Wisconsin. There's been a big change in how we manage natural resources. For 60, 70, 80 years, it was a science-based natural resources management system. In fact, the DNR in 1968 was created to provide science advice to policymakers in the government and provide the public with information, provide the press with information. That's no longer the case. We've changed significantly. So what I'm going to try to do today is talk about 4 projects that I had in my career that I know about. I know there are many more, but 4 that I know about that illustrate the basic principle that if you use science-based management and you do regulation properly and maintain it properly, it can be good for the environment, it can be good for public rights, and it also can be good for the economy and the regulated community if you do it properly. That's the premise of the talk, and I'm going to try to illustrate it with 4 projects that occurred here in the Wisconsin River Basin over the past 40-some years. First one would be the cleanup of the Wisconsin River. The second would be management of dams, both licensing of dams and dam removal, that sort of thing. The third one would be acid rain, and the fourth would be aldecarb in groundwater, in the central sands. So a variety of different water-related issues. And then a discussion about how a new group, Green Fire, Wisconsin Green Fire, can assist in trying to insert science-based management into policy discussions, because the DNR is not doing that anymore. So our group has been formed to try to inject some of that discussion into the policy debates statewide, as well as get information out to the public and to the press on how to use science and science-based natural resources management. Well, the Wisconsin River starts right here on the Michigan border, Lac Vieux des Aires, a little small head dam up there. It runs 430 miles down to the Mississippi River, and in that distance it drops over 1,000 feet, so there's a lot of potential, a lot of head there for energy. The Wisconsin River has been called the hardest working river in America for a number of reasons. First, there are 15 pulp and paper mills discharging to the river. There's about 90 municipalities discharging to the river. There's a lot of non-point source pollution from agriculture discharging to the river. There are 26 hydroelectric dams on the river producing power. There are 21 storage reservoirs, large reservoirs, controlling the flow of the river. So there's a lot of factors there that create a hard-working river. And when I first started working on the Wisconsin River back in 1976, it was overworked for a lot of reasons. It was pretty tired. This was one of the reasons. This is the discharge of the Rhinelander Paper Company to the Wisconsin River in Rhinelander. Most of the paper mills had situations just like this. Straight chutes, straight out of the digester, no treatment, not even primary treatment in some cases. In this particular mill, there were 27 outfalls. Some of them didn't even know where they went throughout the mill, so they couldn't control them. It was really a problem. This is the first flowage south of Rhinelander, about 1968, Hat Rapids flowage, about 6 miles south of Rhinelander. The brown you see on the surface is sludge that was discharged to the river by the paper mill and a municipality. It's sunk to the bottom, decomposed in anaerobic conditions, and those gas bubbles helped to rise the sludge up to the surface. It formed a crust over the top. Small animals could walk right across the flowage. The structure you see in the foreground was designed to be a skimmer to try to skim some of that sludge off the surface. They pumped it over a hill into an unlined pit, which eventually contaminated groundwater. And they lauded this as a good thing to do at the first Earth Day. They said, here, we're cleaning up the river. Well, not exactly. The Clean Water Act of 1972 said the same thing your mother said. Don't make the mess in the first place. Don't clean it up. Don't spend all that money cleaning up the mess. Avoid it in the first place. Keep the waste out of the river. At this particular site, that hydroelectric dam had a hard time operating because there was so much sludge in the water column that the turbines weren't efficient. They were clogged up with sludge all the time. That was another reason for this skimmer on the surface. So, Clean Water Act said you got to clean up all the rivers, fishable, swimmable by 1983. That was the goal. In the Wisconsin River, our main problem was dissolved oxygen. We had 3 40-mile segments of the river that went to zero dissolved oxygen every year. The goal here was not to shut down all the discharges, that's a legitimate use of the river, but to make sure the river's assimilative capacity was fully used but not exceeded. The assimilative capacity of a stream depends on the flow in the river and the temperature. If the natural processes, biological, chemical, dilution, physical processes can dilute waste and accommodate and assimilate waste. People have been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years. But you can't exceed that capacity. So in the upper left, you see at high flow and cool temperatures in the Wisconsin River, you can put a lot of waste in and not threaten the dissolved oxygen standard. Whereas in the upper right, if you have low flow and warm temperatures, you have to drop that waste to a trickle in order to maintain the appropriate amounts of oxygen. And what you get is unacceptable water quality if you don't change those discharges into the river. Well, what we decided to do was to try to calculate exactly how much waste each paper mill and each municipality can discharge into the river depending on the temperature of the water, the season, and the flow. And that's a difficult thing to do. So we ended up developing a computer model. At the time, it was very cutting edge. I can remember we sent cardboard cards to the UW Computing Center at night to try to get these runs done. Now you can probably do it on your phone. But at the time, it was very difficult. And the idea was to try to make sure that we did not exceed the assimilative capacity of the river. And it worked. That same location looks like this now. There's a full fish and aquatic life community there. It doesn't smell. The fish are edible in some cases, although they still have some contaminants. At least they don't smell so bad that you can't cook them. So we had a dramatic improvement in that river. This photo was also of Rhinelander. It was a spill. That gray color you see is titanium dioxide, which was an ingredient in the paper industry. It was a brightener in the paper industry. Somebody turned the wrong valve at 2 o'clock in the morning and out it went. $64,000 worth of ingredient. They didn't want it to go in the river. It was a mistake. But still, every organism that depends on light, and that's all of us, is going to have a hard time in a river like this. The river you see coming in from the right is the Pelican River. In the foreground, this gray river is the Wisconsin. You can see where they're mixing. 12 miles downstream, this river was gray for a week at least. And this happened at least 5 times in the time that we studied the upper Wisconsin River. Well, there again, it's a mistake. They didn't want to do it, but it still had an impact on water quality and aquatic life. The goal is to put in mechanisms in an enforceable permit that prevents that kind of stuff from happening. First of all, concentrate all the waste into one waste stream, minimize it in volume so that it's easier to treat, and make sure that you don't have these kinds of glitches happening with your product. This is a discharge below Rothschild, Weyerhaeuser Paper Company. Those boilings you see there are holes in a pipe that goes out into the river. Unfortunately, there's a big drop between the paper mill and the river, a 40-foot drop. So we had a lot of turbulence. And these discharges of untreated waste contained a lot of long-chain hydrocarbons, lignin and other things from the wood. And when it was agitated, it created a tremendous amount of foam at this site. This is a shot of some of the foam on a pretty good day. I have seen this same site at this location with foam 6 feet deep. You could literally paddle a canoe into the foam and you couldn't see the canoe 5 miles downstream from the discharge point. Obviously unacceptable. The Clean Water Act said that you can't have these kinds of aesthetic impacts on the river in addition to the water quality problems. Every stream south of Merrill had this problem. It's still a problem statewide. I can remember one of the first meetings I ever went to in 1976 when I worked for DNR. They were talking about controlling phosphorus. And they said, in a year or so, we'll have this problem licked. We'll use, calculate exactly how much the stream can tolerate of phosphorus, and then we'll back calculate and do some controls on land use and point sources, and this will be taken care of. Well, here, 40-some years later, we're still arguing about it. And this illustrates an anomaly. Most of the other point source dischargers were controlled with properly designed, scientifically managed wastewater discharge permits, regulatory approach. This is the exception. There is no regulatory approach. There's no regulation of the kinds of land uses that create the phosphorus runoff that creates these problems, algae problems in the river. Whoa, that's not good. Tap it, would you please? Yeah. All right, there you go. Thank you. You're a techie, I can see that. This is a shot of some of the algae in the Big Old Plain flowage. Yeah, and when you put the phosphorus in the river, obviously you get luxuriant algae growth. We still have the same problem. We're still talking about a total maximum daily load for phosphorus in the Wisconsin River. Much more sophisticated modeling, much more data, really good analysis. It all breaks down when you get to the regulation phase. There is no regulation for the source. The point sources were regulated on phosphorus. All the paper mills in municipalities have a discharge limitation enforceable by law on the amount of phosphorus they can discharge. And that was a big deal early on because the paper mills in their early treatment systems had to add phosphorus to the treatment system to get a luxuriant growth of organisms that chewed up the waste coming from the paper mill. So they put in as much as they thought they needed. They actually put in more than they needed as an insurance policy. There were paper mills on the Wisconsin River discharging 18 parts per million, 5 or 6 million gallons per day of phosphorus, because they were adding it to their treatment system to get luxuriant growth. Well, we again did the same thing we did with dissolved oxygen problems, provided a regulation. They're now all less than 1 part per million, but the non-point source from land uses still remain unregulated and uncontrolled, causing the last remaining barrier to good water quality in the Wisconsin River. This is a photo of what happens when all that algae decays. This was in the tailwater of the Old Plain Dam in the late 70s. Those fish are all carp, so you know that the game fish are gone long before these fish died because carp are resistant to dissolved oxygen drops. But this same problem is occurring all over Wisconsin for the same reason. Okay, the second example. First of all, in the first example where we talked about regulation of the paper industry, the people involved in the paper industry said, we'll go out of business. Yeah, our mills will go to Georgia or Alabama where there's no regulation. Our pulp mills will have to shut down. We'll lose jobs. Our local cities and communities are going to be devastated. Actually, what happened was, if you talk to the technical directors of those mills that participated, they spent $350 million in 1986 dollars on capital improvements for waste treatment. They spent about $50 million in operation and maintenance. Not one company went out of business. Not one company moved to Georgia. There was an exemption in Chapter 147 of the statutes that said that if you could really prove that you can't afford to control your environmental mess, you'd get an exemption. Not a single mill even applied for that exemption. Nobody even sued the department. There weren't any lawsuits trying to prevent this thing from happening. They did it, and it worked. And the technical directors, after it was all finished, said that it benefited the industry because it forced them to reduce water use, which is really a big deal in paper because they use a lot of water. It reduced energy cost. They recovered some of the fiber that they were discharging to the river and put it into product. And in addition, all those lignins and all those chemicals that they were dumping into the river that was waste are now used to produce over 100 products that are profit-generating products. They're used to make all kinds of things, from yeast to drilling muds. And that stuff was going into the river as waste, costing the taxpayers and the owners of the water, the citizens of the state, environmental cost. Instead, it was turned into a product, a profit center instead of a loss. So that the first example shows that you can protect the environment, you can protect public rights, and you can benefit the regulated community if you properly do it with scientific analysis and public involvement. The second example is dams on the Wisconsin River. We got dams all over the state, 3,800 of them, all over the place. And they create problems. They interrupt a stream. They interrupt the life in the stream. They cause temperature changes. So you might get higher temperatures in the summer and lower temperatures in the winter than you would get without the dam. They cause dissolved oxygen problems. Water quantity problems, both seasonal and daily, result from dams. And they're a barrier to migrating fish and other organisms that migrate with the fish. They have flow fluctuations. This is an example of hydropeaking. That yellow line would be a relatively constant flow in the river, but the red line is what you actually see from day to day. And the reason for that in the old days was that the kilowatts are worth more in the daytime than they are at night. So they pass as much water as you can through the turbine during the daytime, and that means you got to fill up the pond at night, which means you got to shut the dam off in order to fill the pond. That means that flows downstream of the dam are extremely low. In fact, in Stevens Point, we used to get complaints from minnow trappers who said, you know, there's got to be some kind of a discharge, a toxic discharge. I've got a trap full of minnows, but they're all dead. Well, we went out in the middle of the night, and you could practically walk across the river with street shoes. There wasn't any water in the river because they were filling up the fluids to do this hydropeaking. And that can be changed with the proper licensing. Another problem, and this is rainbow flowage. There's 5 big flowages in the system that are designed to store water when it's available and meter it back into the Wisconsin River to maintain uniform flow. Well, when you get proper snow melt and spring rains, the rainbow flowage looks like this, pretty full. It's got a lot of water to use for flow augmentation. But when you don't get much snow or you don't get spring rains, this is what you have at the rainbow flowage. Literally about a 600-acre stream channel running through what normally would be several thousand acres of water. And this is a real problem if you're an organism depending on that lake or that reservoir environment. We had situations where loons, for example, would when the water was rising, would continue to build up their nests. They'd spend all their time building their nests, trying to keep ahead of the water rising in the spring, and they spent no time incubating the eggs, so the eggs died. On the other side of it, there was not enough water, so you had spawning problems and stranding problems of fish stranded in small, shallow areas. Another problem with dams is turbine mortality. These fish tried to get through a turbine and didn't make it. They just have a real problem because these turbines have big wheels that turn at 100 revolutions per minute, and they've got small holes on the outside of the wheel. That fish has got to get through that hole, down into the draft tube, and miss all the steel that's in that system. Well, most of them don't miss the steel. We did a study at Centralia Dam on the Wisconsin River and found 835,000 fish per year going through one dam. And these fish are migratory. All these species want to move 60, 70, 100 miles if there are no dams. They want to go through multiple dams. If the mortality on those 835,000 fish was only 10%, that's more fish than are speared in northern Wisconsin by the tribes. And each dam has that mortality. So it's a significant issue. You don't usually see it because of the color of the water and because when these fish are cut, they often sink to the bottom, are eaten by scavengers. And even the employees at the dam said that they had never seen a dead fish. There were thousands of them in their tailwaters. So they're out there, and it's a problem associated with having dams on the river. Here's another issue. At several locations on the Wisconsin River, there's a bypass. This is Grandfather Falls between Tomahawk and Merrill. It's the largest head dam on the river. It produces the most electricity. And it's great to produce electricity with water because you're not burning fossil fuels. In this case, instead of just putting a dam right here on the Wisconsin River, which would generate about 35 feet of head, they built a man-made bypass all the way up to the top up there, and they increased the head to 95 feet, almost tripling the amount of electricity you could get out of that water. And that's great for producing extra power, But it's not so great if you were an organism living in the old Wisconsin River channel that had been there since the glaciers receded and now has no water or has intermittent water. So what we did with regulation is not outlaw the process, but to tell them put a minimum flow in that channel so that all those fish and organisms can survive at the same time that you're producing all this great hydroelectric power that doesn't require combustion of fossil fuels. It's a way of making sure that the economics is protected at the same time you're protecting the organisms. This little stream is the Prairie River. Nice little river in Lincoln County. Good trout stream, really excellent for brook trout. In fact, the state record brook trout came out of the Prairie River in 1944. Good growth rates. This is a location in Lincoln County. It's Prairie Dells. This photo was taken in 1905. You see the high rock outcrops in a steep canyon. This is a dam builder's dream. They could get 65 feet ahead by building a dam between those two rock outcrops. And so they did. The problem is that the engineer literally misplaced a decimal point in calculating how much power you could get out of that water flow. So by the time they had the dam built and they had the powerhouse built and they had the turbines all installed, they realized they were not going to be able to recoup their investment because there was only going to be 1/10 the amount of electricity potential. So here's the old powerhouse down here. You can see it's all falling apart. They took the turbines out and put them in the Grandfather Falls project where they're still producing power today. But that meant that dam sat there for 95 years with no revenue stream and therefore no repairs. Nobody was taking care of it. In the state of Wisconsin, you have two choices if you're a dam owner. You either repair the dam and bring it up to Chapter 31 safe dam standards, or you take it out. Those are the only two choices. Well, this was obviously not up to state standards. I mean, it was literally crumbling. And in fact, what happened is the river found a new channel under the dam. The concrete in the dam was very hard, but it found a new channel and eroded underneath the structure. And so the people downstream were in danger of a catastrophic failure. We told them to remove the dam or replace it. $2 million was the estimate to replace the dam. It had no potential for a revenue stream. There were a few people living in the area, and they were very adamant about keeping that little pond of about 100 acres, but nobody wanted to come up with $2 million. And so what happened is eventually it was ordered to be removed. You can see the bad condition of the structure. We finally blasted it. It resulted in all kinds of problems downstream because we had 100 years of sediment that had built up behind that dam, and that all had to be washed out of the system. Very steep sediment walls. It looked like hell. But a couple months later, it was recolonized by stoneflies and mayflies and kayakers and trout, and people use it for recreation now. It's a very beautiful stream. It was restored to its normal uses. The dam used to run between these two rock outcrops there, and now the river is one of our more scenic in the area. Excellent brook trout fishery. The dam downstream was the last one on the river. There are 4 dams on the Prairie. This was the Ward Dam. It was owned by a paper mill. Paper mill went out of business. They decided that they didn't want to maintain this dam anymore. It was only producing $34,000 worth of electricity per year, and it was costing $50,000 just for the insurance. And they paid $100 and some thousand the year before to a bunch of landowners upstream that were flooded because the gate stuck. It wasn't maintained properly. So they said, let's remove the dam. And the DNR said, that's great. That's the last barrier on the river. All those fish, warm water fish that want to go upstream to spawn can move back and forth if the dam is not there. All the cold water fish can come down and use the lower river for winter habitat and then go back upstream for spawning in the fall. So we agreed. It was a great idea. There again, nobody wanted to get rid of it. There were 90-some people who said they could see this water. Nobody wanted that pond to go away. But no one would come up with the $2 million it would take to make this dam safe. Nobody could come up with that money. We had threats of all kinds. One guy called in. We were working out of the International Papers building. He called in and said, if you don't stop taking out that dam, I'm going to blow up the building that you're working in. Unfortunately, the building was part of the dam, so if he had blown up the building, we'd have blown up the dam at the same time. And he left this message on a machine, which was traceable back to the phone that he... it was a crazy thing, but it illustrates There's logic and there's dam logic. They don't always overlap. So we started into the process. People were all mad. There were black balloons on the bridges. They had signs all over. This one said, "International papers and DNR, you should be ashamed for taking the dam out. Welcome to Merrill, City of Parks," crossed out, now mud flats, thanks to the DNR. Take a second to say goodbye to the lake. The mud hole you see was sponsored by the DNR. This one says, "Welcome to Merrill, City of Mud." People were mad. There were over 140 signs in the city of Merrill saying, "Don't take this dam out." But nobody wanted to come up with the $2 million. So removing the dam restored the ecosystem. It protected public rights because a whole part of the city was downstream of the dam and had to pay extra insurance for dam break analysis. Some of the areas couldn't even get a permit from a bank to do a construction project or couldn't get a loan because of the dam break analysis. But when the dam was gone, that all went away. People said that their houses were going to lose value. We did a study, a real estate study. After it was all finished, the value went up because they had a trout stream and a park in front of their house instead of a lake that was filling up with sediment. The park was 120 acres. DNR provided money to put in habitat structures and trees and trails and bridges and all sorts of things. And the value of the properties went up. The environment was protected, public rights were protected, and the local economy benefited because they didn't have to pay the $2 million plus maintenance for the dam. They didn't have to worry about getting their loans from the bank, and their property values went up in addition to producing a 120-acre park in the city. And now it's been restored. Okay, the third example is acid rain. In 1979, we decided we'd start sampling rainfall in lakes, northern Wisconsin. We found out that the rain in northern Wisconsin was 10 to 100 times as acid as normal. We did the first rain sampling station in the Midwest. Well, that was surprising. We went to the DNR in the central office and said, "Hey, this is going to be a problem." They said, "No, acid rain's not a problem. That's New York, it's Ohio, it's some other place. It's not here. Stop working on it." So we went to EPA and got a bunch of grants and kept working on it and found out there are a whole bunch of lakes that are susceptible, maybe 2,000. We found a dozen lakes that had showed signs of starting to change already. They're in the northern part of the state. Low alkalinity lakes, lakes that were seepage lakes, no inlet or outlet, susceptible to the acid in the rain. We said, "Hey, this is a real problem. We got to stop the acidification of these lakes." We did some mercury analysis and showed that the low pH was related to mercury uptake in the fish, further causing a health issue. Again, we got the same problem. Eventually, we finally got support from the local, the state DNR, and they said, "Okay, we're going to go forward with this." This is an example of scientific information changing the philosophy, not only in the political system, but in the DNR, which is supposed to be science-based. They were changed by the data that we collected with support from EPA. Eventually, there was a law passed that said you had to reduce the emissions that are causing these acid problems. There again, we had the same pattern we had before. The utilities said, "Oh, no, we can't possibly do that. Our kilowatt cost is going to go through the roof. Our businesses are going to be moving away. We'll have the most expensive electricity in America." Just the opposite happened. We told them, "Don't build scrubbers. Don't build these multi-million-dollar scrubbers on every power plant in the state. Go west and get low-sulfur coal instead." Built it right into the law. They did. Went out and got some low-sulfur coal contracts. They're 30-year contracts. They locked them in. Eventually, the federal government passed a law that was just like Wisconsin. The Acid Rain Control Act of 1986 that we passed was eventually passed on the federal level. Then everybody wanted low-sulfur coal. Our utilities had locked in a low price because this coal was a little lower in BTUs and therefore not as desirable. They locked it in for 30 years. We ended up with some of the lowest cost kilowatts, at least in the Midwest, and some say in the United States. There again, we reversed the problem in water quality, protected the environment, protected the public rights in all those lakes, and at the same time ended up with some of the lowest cost kilowatts, in spite of the predictions from the utilities, in the Midwest. further illustrating the point. The final example is aldicarb in the central sands. We started sampling wells in the central sands and found high nitrates. We thought, well, if the nitrates are moving through the soil, the pesticides are probably moving also. So we started taking some samples. DNR said, nope, you can't even take them to our lab of hygiene because, for instance, this aldicarb that we were working with is not soluble in water. It can't move into the groundwater. It's impossible. We're not going to authorize you to do those analyses at the state lab of hygiene. So we went to the late, great Dr. Byron Shaw's laboratory here at Stevens Point, Task Force Lab. He did all the analysis for us. We found 6 or 7 pesticides in groundwater, in addition to aldicarb, plus a whole bunch of nitrate problems. Well, the aldicarb was only coming from one place. It was used on potatoes. It was used to try to kill potato beetles on the plant. Union Carbide, the manufacturer, said, you have to use this. You can't tolerate a single potato beetle on your crop or you won't have a yield. So all the growers used it. Well, we had an extension study, getting back to the science. We asked them, how many potato beetles can you tolerate on a plant before your yield goes down? They found it was 8 or 9 per plant. So we eventually got a bill passed that outlawed the use of aldicarb on these kinds of soils and groundwater situations where it could leach into the groundwater. Same thing happened. The potato growers said, we're going to go out of business. We can't possibly grow potatoes without aldicarb. What happened? They stopped using aldicarb because it was banned on those soils. They found out that the amount of money they were sending to Union Carbide to buy the aldicarb and paying to spread it on their fields was pretty close to what they were making per acre. It was a significant cost savings for those growers. They had a little bit of a yield drop, but not much. Certainly not enough to cause an economic problem for them. So here, the pattern holds true again. Protected the environment, protected public rights in the groundwater. In this case, their own families were drinking water that aldicarb had leached down into. And still, the potato growers didn't go out of business. They're just as much more profitable now and larger than they ever have been. It illustrates the same pattern. And I think the point here is that if you use science-based management, use the data, use the scientific method, advise the policymakers on what kinds of options are out there, what the consequences might be, you can get better results than you can if you use a philosophical statement. For example, lately, the philosophical trend is all regulation is bad. It costs jobs and things like that. It's just not true. If you look at the cases that have been studied, it has not been borne out by data. Well, that's a problem because some of our agencies, our universities, our DNR, are not as science-based as they used to be 10 years ago. We've had our science section in DNR cut dramatically in positions and dollars. We've had restrictions on what you could even put in an email in terms of discussing climate change, much less what you can research. The university has had that same problem because it's a philosophical determination instead of a scientific determination deciding how you're going to manage natural resources. So a year or so, a bunch of us disgruntled old DNR, ex-DNR science workers just got together, and Terry Dalton had a great idea to come up with an organization we eventually named Green Fire. The goal was to come up with a list of people who have expertise in a variety of scientific areas, try to step in for the absent DNR when there are no DNR science workers testifying at legislative hearings on scientific issues, when there are no DNR science workers giving press releases and explaining to the press the intricacies of scientific issues, where there are no DNR workers even going to public forums like this, explaining to people what the issues are, what the data says, what the scientific method advises us to do. If the DNR can't do it, if they were set up to do this in 1968 when they were reorganized, they were set up to give scientific advice to policymakers, then we decided we better have a group that steps in and does that. So we hope to do that by not only testifying before the legislature, but sending information to the press, sending information to the public, trying to make sure that the concept of science is supported in natural resources management. The actual concept of science is under attack in this regime. We want to make sure that changes. We now have 450 members. At least half of those are scientific background people from the university or from the DNR or federal agencies who've had long careers in specific scientific disciplines, and we hope to make use of this cadre of experience to try to at least do something. Don't just sit in there and read the newspaper and get frustrated. Get out there and do something about injecting science into the policy conversation. We pledge to be nonpartisan, but we will be political. We will be working in a political system. There's a big difference between being political and being partisan. We do not want to be partisan. We want to stick to the scientific information. We want to try to avoid advocacy, stick to the data, the science, and the conclusions that we can support, and advise people accordingly. So that's our goal, and I think that what I've tried to do is to give examples of some projects from the past that illustrate how everybody can benefit if you properly manage environmental regulation using science, and how our current system is not doing that. Therefore, we need a group like Wisconsin Green Fire to at least make an attempt to interject that into the policy discussions. That's my story. Thank you. Any questions or comments?
So, do you think people have examples of regulations that do not do all those things?
Oh, yes. There's lots of them out there. And usually what happens, the question was, are there examples of regulations out there that don't achieve these goals, and why? I think it's the ones that are used as examples are generally general regulations applying to a whole country or a whole state instead of specific local. They're ones that don't have measurable goals. They're regulations that don't have flexibility in design so that you can use adaptive management year after year to make those regulations more efficient and better, make them more targeted to the goal instead of just having regulation for regulation's sake. There are regulations that don't have an out for economics. So, example I gave about Chapter 147 with the paper mills gave them an out. They had a mechanism so that they could truly prove with data that they couldn't afford it, there was another way to go. We have to make sure that those systems are developed in addition to the science workers in DNR, are developed by the people that are affected by the regulation. So in the case of the Wisconsin River, we had 3 advisory committees. A policy committee made up of all the mayors and county board chairs up and down the river who said their cities were going to be affected. A technical committee was made up of university professors, DNR people from a lot of different disciplines, and the mills themselves, all their technical directors, their consultants, their lawyers, their production people in the mill were involved in developing those regulations. They were also involved in developing the model that told how much waste could go into the river so that they had confidence in that model. They didn't sue at all at the end and say that our model is ineffective or that our mechanism for achieving the goal was ineffective, because they were right there with us month after month for 4 years developing the technical side of this whole process. So regulations that don't do those things have a bad reputation because they don't have the same kinds of results, in my opinion.
A couple more questions. I'd like to know a little bit more about Green Fire. A lot of people in the state would maybe be members or supporters of like Thousand Friends of Wisconsin or something like that. So is Green Fire a similar advocacy group, and how broad is their mission, and how does an individual support them?
Well, there's a major discussion within Green Fire right now about the difference between science and advocacy. The goal is to separate those, keep advocacy in the purview of advocacy groups, statewide advocacy groups, environmental groups. Green Fire would then supply those other groups with information, scientific analysis, sources of information, experts to be interviewed, expert witnesses for court cases, things like that. But I think those of us who've been through the wars know that you can't completely separate advocacy from science. There has to be a blend there somewhat, and that's one of the things we're arguing about in the organization now. There's a long body of literature nationwide about the separation between science and advocacy, and we want to respect that at the same time being effective in the political debates. Requires that you have to at least make some choices, based on your scientific analysis of the 6 options, which ones would you choose? And you'd have to give pluses and minuses for all those 6 options. And then the next question is, which of the 6 would you choose? So you might actually be in a position of choosing 1 or 2 of those options, which could bring you closer to the advocacy side of the scale. So it's a debate right now.
So is there a role for the average citizen in Wisconsin in Green Fire, or is it just, watching and hoping that Green Fire feeds into those other advocates?
There is a role for the average citizen, for the scientists, for everyone who's interested in natural resources. As I mentioned, we had about 450 members. Only about half of those are people who had 30-year careers in some scientific discipline. The rest are people who are concerned about the attack on science, about the lack of science in policy making, and they are making contributions to Green Fire, saying, here's $1,000 to help you defray your expenses in testifying in the legislature, whatever. So we have general membership, professional membership, and student membership, 3 different kinds of memberships in Green Fire. We're hoping that everyone can find a niche for themselves in that organization. We don't want to duplicate all the other environmental groups in the state. We want to complement their efforts and give information so their advocacy will be more effective.
And if you wanted to learn more, where would you go?
We have a website, naturally, and the mission statement, the values, and the vision are all listed on that website, explaining how we intend to operate. The board members are listed there. There are periodic white papers. We have one on wetlands, for instance, and on wolves. A few other issues are being developed now. Those will be published on our website, and we hope to have a dialogue on a lot of these issues.
And what is the website?
What is it?
What's it called? What's the website? Is it greenfire.org?
Our president is sitting right here, Terry Dalton.
wigreenfire.org. And we also have a Facebook page. We don't have a Twitter yet. But we have a blog post on there where we've got folks writing occasional blogs. So we're doing updates. We are doing a lot of action alert kind of things because we don't want to end up duplicating all the things the other NGOs are doing. So we're seeing ourselves trying to kind of hone down and be really strategic on what it is that we can do, because we are still basically a volunteer-driven organization of people mostly over 50 or 60 years old. So, our technology is a little sagging. In fact, one of the things...
Yeah, you can see our technology right there.
Some of us have achieved the ability to do PowerPoint. But one thing to mention to the students who are here, one of our interests is also working with up-and-coming natural resources professionals. And we've only been in existence for a year. We're interested in working with people who are interested in professions, mentoring. We haven't quite figured out how to do that, but I think there's opportunities there. There's some groups here at Point that wanted to participate in some of the things that we're doing. So that would be a shout out to anybody here who's got a group that's interested in that kind of work.
I just wanted to emphasize that although I had the honor of supervising a lot of these things that I talked about, each one of them had a group of a dozen disciplines, maybe 2 or 3 people in each discipline, ranging from environmental engineers to economists, lawyers, public involvement people, you name it, all sorts of disciplines involved. And that is the way to really have a collaborative scientific product that stands up. And that's what we're trying to do with Green Fire, is take advantage of that wide range of disciplines represented to make sure we get advice on all sides of the issue. I can't emphasize enough that those cooperative efforts are out there. There are very few individual efforts in science, I think, and certainly not in natural resources management. And that's what we're trying to do with Green Fire as well, be a collaborative effort inside and outside the organization. There will be times when we'll have to seek outside experts if we have a deficiency of experience in our group, and we intend to do that to make sure that we cover all the bases.
What are some of the current research Green Fire's been involved with, or are they in that kind of level where they are?
Well, we have members that have been involved in research all their careers, so most of them have kept up with their area of expertise after they retired. Several of them are continuing to work on research, either in the university or research that's going on in DNR. We don't have a lot of pure research going on within Green Fire because we don't have the funds to do it, but the individuals are still engaged in their areas of expertise.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just a little bit more interested, I guess, in maybe some of the issues that are going around.
Well, the first big one we hit was the Wetlands Bill. There's several Wetlands bills that went through the legislature. We produced a white paper on the subject. We sent people to testify at the hearings, both local hearings and hearings before the legislature. We put out press releases on the subject. Tried to engage in the discussion that was going on how to change that law. Another one was the wolf controversy. We did the same thing, same kinds of things. And those white papers will be on our website as we go along. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
A lot of the solutions to the problems that you talked about were regulatory. Do you think that's the right way to go for carbon emissions? I know a lot of people have talked about carbon fee and dividend or cap and trade or things like that, which are more, my sense is that those are more sort of trying to give an incentive rather than a regulation.
I guess the question was, do you think it's necessary to use regulation in almost all cases, especially climate change? I think each case has to have a blend of voluntary, educational, and regulatory components. Some of them are all, mostly regulatory. Others are mostly voluntary. In the case of phosphorus, for example, we're left with almost all voluntary education, involvement, new research explaining how to do things better, because we don't have a regulatory component. In the case of climate change, there are very few regulatory components. But the science is really important there because it can explain to policymakers how you can actually make money by protecting the climate and preventing it from changing. There are at least a dozen ways you could actually implement things that will make money instead of costing money to get a good start. So that's an example of how you might use a voluntary or research approach in an area where the regulatory side is not well developed yet. You can still study the regulatory side, see which approaches in Europe or other countries are working, and convey that information. And we do have a climate change section with a lot of professionals, a variety of different disciplines, actually discussing that very topic. You're welcome to participate if you wish. Anything else?
As far as funding goes, your organization, are you a 501c3 or how do you get?
We're close to it. I think we might actually have achieved it. It's our intention to be a 501c3. We have, $70,000 or $80,000 in contributions now for operating expenses. Our memberships are a pretty good source of that money, but we have people writing checks for thousands of dollars as well because they believe in the concept and they believe that there's been an erosion in the way that Wisconsin has managed natural resources over the past 7 or 8 decades, and the way it's worked in the past isn't working now. And so people believe, I think, even if they don't have scientific expertise, that they need to contribute to an organization that tries to advance that idea. Anyone that wants to join is welcome. Anyone who wants to contribute is welcome. Did you hear that, Jake?
One thing I could say, I think in our first year, the fundraising was probably easier than it's going to be in the second and third years because we were kind of new and people were sort of captivated by the idea. We took our name from, Leopold, and we had our first annual meeting at the Alvin Leopold Foundation. Tia Nelson, Gaylord Nelson's daughter came, and it was our keynote. It was really very inspiring. I think as we move ahead, even though we're starting to get actually into the work, it may not be as easy to get donations. I was amazed, our average donation was close to $100, and that's pretty remarkable for a new group, but I don't think we'll probably see that in year two. So not that we expect students to be big funders, but I think having people join and also having people donate will help us to continue on. And we have hired someone as a half-time contract administrative staff because there's amazing how much work goes into getting your 501c3 and those kinds of things.
My personal goal is to see a day when we don't need a green fire.
Right.
And it's built into the operation of state government and corporations and private citizens' lives. And you use data and logic and a scientific method and sound business decision making. You don't run into these inefficient problems that we've had.
I'm just curious, have you gotten any response or feedback from corporations or business about what you're trying to do and whether they're supportive of that or if they're meeting up sort of with resistance, particularly on the sort of industrial end of production, and sort of just what response you're getting as it relates?
Well, we don't have a corporate membership category, but we have, of course, communicated with corporations. Some of them are very supportive, some are not, as usual. It's sort of like climate change. There are a lot of corporations out there that are really believe you need to do something now, and others not so much. So I guess I can't characterize the whole corporate community, but I think personally I feel there's a shift in people's attitudes and in corporate attitudes all over the country, realizing that you don't have to choose between jobs and the environment, that you can make money protecting the environment. And the advantages, if you use full life cycle cost accounting, the advantages are always more cost effective than doing it the old way and allowing society to support the costs. Thank you.